In this chapter of Deuteronomy, we have Moses' long life coming to its end. It appropriately finishes where the last book he wrote finishes, Deuteronomy chapter 34. We may wonder how Moses could have written this, because no one afterwards can write about their own death. But of course his successor Joshua would have written this last chapter. The Lord would have supplied him with the details, especially of what we read in verses 5 and 6. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord, and he buried him in a valley in the land of Moab, over against Beth Peor, but no man knoweth of his sepulchre unto this day. These details of Moses' passing are important. They are recorded for us to learn from. Moses' long life is instructive, but so is the end of his life. And let us consider what this means for us this evening, particularly verse 5, where we read that Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And the message is summed up in that title given to Moses in verse 5, the servant of the Lord. So let us see two things. Firstly, the service, Moses, the servant of the Lord, and then the closing. He died according to the word of the Lord. First then, the service. Moses, the servant of the Lord. If he had had a headstone and an epitaph, then surely this would have been a good and an appropriate one. He is called this 16 times in Deuteronomy and later. This summary of his life here might have been otherwise. He might have been called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, mighty in words and deeds, the man of God, a prophet of the Lord, whom the Lord knew face to face, lawgiver, or even what we read in chapter 33, verse 5, king in Yeshurun. But it's this, the servant of the Lord. And it reminds us that it's this where true honor lies, the Lord's servant. We do not normally think of being a servant as something high and noble, rather a lowly concept. But it depends on whom you are servant to, doesn't it? For instance, a civil servant is quite a high position. If you are a servant in the royal house, in Buckingham Palace, or one of the other royal houses, that is a very honourable and high thing. I remember meeting a man many years ago who had a position in Buckingham Palace. He knew Prince Charles as he was then personally, and he was very ready to tell us all about his position and all that he was doing, and he was absolutely full of it. He was a servant, but it's whom you serve that gives the true honour. And here, the servant of the Lord. All true Christians are this. Colossians 3, verse 24, the Apostle Paul could encourage the slaves at Colossae, working for nothing for their Roman masters, and encouraging them to do their work as Christians. And he said to them, for ye serve the Lord Christ. And that's a tremendously elevating thing, isn't it? Doing the drudgery, the menial tasks. And yet, as unto the Lord, to your master in heaven, ye serve the Lord Christ. What a sanctifying and exalting thing that is, isn't it? That would be a good text for any employee, wouldn't it? Ultimately, beyond the boss, beyond the company that pays your salary, ye serve the Lord Christ. Do your work with an eye to pleasing him, and you'll do your work honorably and well. Romans 12, verse 11, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord. And that's the greatest honor possible, because we're serving the King of Kings. The Lord said in John 12 and verse 26, if any man serve me, him will my Father honor. Anything done as a Christian for Christ, whether in what we call a secular realm or in Christian context and work, it's the same thing. The servant of the Lord. And keeping that in view gives you a wonderful outlook on duty, responsibility, accountability. In Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, Christian had this thing before him when he was in the valley of humiliation, and Apollyon confronted him and wanted to know why Christian had left Apollyon's service. And Christian told him why. And one of the reasons was this, quote, and besides, O thou destroying Apollyon, to speak truth, I like his service, his wages, his servants, his government, his company and country better than thine. Therefore leave off to persuade me further. I am his servant and will follow him. What a marvelous confession of faith that is. But because we are servants, it was so for Moses and it's so for us, because we are servants, it explains why the Lord deals with us as he does. The servant of the Lord. Because it is not so much our service as our fitness for it that counts in the sight of God. If we concentrate, as he would have us to do, on the kind of servants we should be, it reflects well upon our Master, who will then use us as vessels unto honor, sanctified and meet for the Master's use. And you think about it in the case of Moses. We're told he lived to be 120 years old before he died. And his life is conveniently divided up into 3 portions of 40 years. And the first 40 years were growing up in the palace of Pharaoh, the son of Pharaoh's daughter, and being taught all the tremendous education and skills and powers that would have been available for him to learn in that favored connection. And then the second 40 years, keeping the sheep of his father-in-law in the deserts of Midian. And the third 40 years, leading the people of Israel out of Egypt and leading them to the edge of the promised land. Someone has said this, that Moses spent 40 years becoming a somebody, 40 years becoming a nobody, and 40 years discovering what God can do with a nobody as the servant of the Lord. And we might think that middle period, a whole 40 years, it's a long time in the wilderness, alone there with the sheep. But not 1 minute was wasted or too long, because it was to fashion and prepare Moses for serving the Lord. You know from the early chapters of Exodus, he met the Lord in the burning bush. There was revelation. There was communion with the Lord as he did his work. There was the commission to bring the people of Israel out of Egypt. There were the promises of God's presence with him. And all this was forming him and preparing him for that great work, that third part, the 40 years. And it reminds us, dear friends, that it matters what we are before what we do as the servants of the Lord. Character before service, always. The Lord will not have servants who have sparkling gifts and exercise them in a carnal way. He will rather have sanctified, holy, fully prepared and furnished servants, even with lesser gifts, that he might have the glory and be prepared to use them for his glory. Remember what McShane said, it is not great gifts that God blesses, but great likeness to Jesus. A holy minister is an awful weapon in the hand of God. So 40 years, all that concentrated, gracious work in Moses and for Moses. You got the same in John the Baptist, or in the deserts of Israel before his showing unto Israel. You've got it in the life of our Lord, 30 years before he begins his 3 years public ministry. It's never too long. None of it is wasted. It's a wrong thing to be impatient and impetuous and raring to go and wanting to get busy. No, the Lord will spend all the time he wants preparing servants to serve him as the kind of people he wants us to be, whether in formal ministry or as individual Christians, serving the Lord in the local church, doing whatever we do. Always it's what kind of servant I am before what kind of service I render. And of course, it shows how Moses could be the meek man that he was in that third 40 years. In Numbers 12 and verse 3, you've got that comment about Moses. And the context, of course, is a very provoking one for Moses. It says there in brackets, now the man Moses was very meek above all the men which were upon the face of the earth. That was probably inserted by Joshua. But the context is, as you know, that Miriam and Aaron were very concerned about something. And that was the fact that Moses' new wife, after Zipporah had died, was an Ethiopian woman. And they were very concerned, because this was not proper and right. And you can imagine Miriam going round to Aaron's tent. Aaron, I really have a problem with this, you know. It's very concerning. And Aaron said, yes, of course it is. Yes, how could he do such a thing? And they spake against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married. It might be that when Moses lost Zipporah, his sister Miriam thought maybe she'd have more of Moses for herself again, like before. And she was looking forward to that, only to find he gets married again. But what a wife. Now, this was not forbidden by the law of Moses, but they were very concerned. But, verse 2, this was the real reason. The other was a pretext, you see. It can sound so spiritual, can't it? Oh, I'm very concerned about what's that person's doing. But this is it. Hath the Lord indeed spoken only by Moses? Hath he not spoken also by us? And you see, that was the real reason. It wasn't a genuine concern. It was that they were jealous of Moses, who had the supreme authority. And even though Miriam was a prophetess and Aaron was the high priest, Moses' younger brother was the generalissimo, as it were, the top man. And they didn't like that, and they became jealous, very unspiritual. The Lord heard it. What did Moses do? How did he react to that carping, sniping, criticism and complaint? The man Moses was very meek above all the men which were upon the face of the earth. You see, if he was full of himself and full of his gifts and self-importance, he would have seen red with something like this. But because he was the servant, and a holy and a gracious, meek servant, he said nothing. And the wonderful thing is that when you get to verse 7, my servant Moses, says God. And then verse 8, he brings the culprits out. And he says, wherefore then were ye not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? And what you've got is the master taking up the cause of his servant, who didn't have to. That's meekness, isn't it? When it's a personal attack, leave it with the Lord. Don't have to defend yourself. And if there's need for vindication, the Lord will give it. And the Lord certainly did here. And Miriam, the ringleader, was struck with leprosy temporarily and was only delivered by the prayer of Moses. And Aaron was humbled and put to shame as well. So you see, it's a wonderful thing. If you're the servant of the Lord, if you're aiming to please only him, when you get attacked and vilified and called names and complained against, when it's not an issue of principle concerning the truth, but it's only just oneself, you can just leave it with the Lord. As we sang in Psalm 37, he shall bring forth thy righteousness as the light, and thy judgment as the noonday. Leave it in his hands. Spurgeon, at the height of the downgrade controversy, when he was being dragged through the mud terribly, and he said, I lost my reputation long ago. I've given it to the Lord, and it's in his hands. And he said, the next 50 years will vindicate me. And certainly haven't they? And afterwards too. Who reads the books of the liberals now that attack Spurgeon so much? But everybody reads Spurgeon. Everything he's ever produced is delighted in and made a blessing and will be to the church to the end of time. God vindicates his servants. And so there can and should be that meekness and that concern not for one's own reputation, but the Lord's honor. Leave it with him. And if you ever find yourself upset or offended by something that someone said to you or about you, ask yourself, who are you really concerned to serve? The Lord or yourself? And so the service was impressive and instructive. The Lord worked grace into Moses, and he became the character he did and the servant he did. And he died there at the close of such a marvelous life and ministry, the servant of the Lord. But let's see the other thing, and that is the closing. He died according to the word of the Lord. Now, it's interesting, isn't it? When a believer dies, it's not just the end of his life, it is also the close of his service on earth. And it gives it great significance, the end of life. And the Lord had said to Moses in Numbers 27, verse 13, that he would die outside the land of Canaan. Thou shalt be gathered unto thy people after thou hast seen the inheritance, the land of Canaan. He wouldn't be allowed to lead the people into the promised rest. And it's a beautiful way of putting it here. Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab according to the word of the Lord, what God had said. But going back, I think, to Numbers 27 and verse 13, there's that beautiful expression where it says, when thou hast seen the land, thou shalt be gathered unto thy people. And that must mean, mustn't it, his soul gathered to heaven to be with the people of the Lord. And that's the same for us all. When we die, we go home to our people, the Lord's people. In Ephesians 3 and verse 15, it speaks of the church as the whole family in heaven and in earth. And so you see, death for the believer is to depart from the family below to that part of the family above and to join the glorified there. As Wesley put it, one family, we dwell in him, one church above, beneath, though now divided by the stream, the narrow stream of death. One army of the living God, to his command we bow. Part of his host have crossed the flood, and part are crossing now. And Moses is among them, crossing over, joining the church above, gathered to his people. That phrase in verse 5, chapter 34 of Deuteronomy, according to the word of the Lord, what the Lord said. But it's literally according to the mouth of the Lord. And some authorities have suggested that it can actually mean kiss, which is what one does with one's lips. And so he died according to the kiss of the Lord. The Lord kissed him to sleep. It's a beautiful expression. It's just like when a father puts the little toddler to bed, cot, I suppose, and then there's that last kiss before it lies down to sleep. And you can view death like that. He has kissed us with the kisses of his mouth, in planting upon us his word lovingly. But that last kiss will be the one that will put us to sleep as our soul is gathered to our people above. For he who dies believing dies safely through thy love. And he did not die in the close of his life in the promised land, of course. Verse 5 of our text, he died in the land of Moab. Now, humanly, that ought not to have been, because you remember when Israel rebelled over the 12 spies, and that generation was sentenced to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until they all died. But Caleb and Joshua and Moses were accepted, and Moses survived. And so, humanly speaking, you'd have thought that he would have led them into the promised land. But something happened to change this. And you know what it is. In Numbers chapter 20, when the Lord told Moses to speak to the rock, and a miracle of water would flow from it to meet the needs of the complaining Israelites. It was desperate. They were desperately thirsty. Speak to the rock, Moses, and the water will come, and they'll all be supplied. But Moses was provoked, uncharacteristically. He was provoked on this occasion, lost his temper. And you see, the meekest of people, whose prominent grace is meekness, will have an opposite corruption that will be very strong. And there's the danger, you see. The devil goes for a Christian who's reputable and notable and known as someone, say, very meek. But if the devil can get that person through circumstances, provocation, critical situation to act entirely the opposite, if carnal nature does rise, it does rise, and it manifests itself in that opposite strength of temper. And of course, that's what Moses did. And he said, "Hear now, ye rebels, must we bring water from the rock?" And he smote the rock with his rod. The water still came. But Moses and Aaron committed a great sin. They did not sanctify the Lord in the eyes of the people of Israel. "Must we bring water from the rock?" And he hit the rock as if it was his own actions that were doing it, instead of the provision of God. And so both Moses and Aaron were then told that they would not be able to enter the promised land. He's shown it beforehand, and then the Lord kisses him to sleep, and he buries him. And it's Joshua, of course, who is Moses' successor, who will lead the people into the promised land. Moses dies in Moab, just short of Canaan. But of course, if you think about it, it had to be like that, didn't it? Humanly speaking, Moses would have been expected to do it. But it had to happen the way it did because there's a typical reason, isn't there? A matter of typology. Moses stands for the law. Canaan is a type of heaven. The law cannot bring anyone into heaven. Only Jesus can. And Jesus is the Greek equivalent of the Hebrew Joshua. And so the Lord protects the honor of his Son in this type, so that it might never be said that Moses, the lawgiver, brought the people into the promised land. No. It must be Joshua, Jesus, who brings the people into the promised land, typically heaven, and the blessing and grace of the gospel. And so you've got it in Hebrews 4 and verse 6, where it actually says, if Jesus had given them rest, meaning the people of Israel into Canaan, of course it's meaning Joshua, but Joshua Jesus. It's interchangeable because it's Jesus is the Greek equivalent of the Hebrew Joshua. It means Jehovah is salvation. But Moses did everything to prepare Israel for inheriting Canaan, knowing full well that he wouldn't have the joy of leading them in. And that's meekness again, isn't it? It's not my part or privilege now to have that prominent role that would have crowned my life and ministry, leading the people, settling them in the promised land. It's going to be given to another, a younger man, Joshua. Did Moses mind that? He did ask if that sentence could be reversed, and the Lord said no. But he did all he could as an alternative to prepare the people for their entrance into the promised land. And that's meekness. When you give way and you don't mind that it's not you, but someone else. And it's meekness to accept when the Lord says no concerning something, and to submit lovingly and trustfully. That's meekness. But to conclude, there is a happier sequel to this, because you see, he died according to the word of the Lord, in verse 5, in the land of Moab. Now, Moab was east of the River Jordan. nearly all the other tribes had their inheritance westward, over the Jordan. But you remember Manasseh, Reuben, and the half, yes, anyway, 2.5 tribes. Can't quite remember who they are. 2.5 tribes had their inheritance east of Jordan. Reuben was one of them. And he had his portion on the other side of Jordan, the east side. And so, his portion, therefore, east of the Jordan, became the land of Canaan. It's counted as so. The 2.5 tribes west of Jordan. So actually, Moses was buried in what became Canaan. So he could not live to see it, but he died to be buried in it. But there's more. 1,400 years later, and you find in Matthew 17 and verse 3 that there is a mountain north in Israel, Mount Tabor it's thought to be, and the Lord is transfigured before his 3 disciples, Peter, James, and John, and there appear in that marvelous forecast and type of heaven Moses and Elias with Jesus. And so that's definitely in the land of Canaan, in Israel, wherever exactly that mountain was. No one knows for certain. And so Moses did see the land of Canaan afterwards on the Transfiguration Mount, brought from heaven to have that privilege with Elijah to be with the Lord there. And that is a beautiful sequel, because it doesn't end with Moses being shut out and refused. His body was buried there, and afterwards he appeared with the Lord Jesus himself to be there as part of his glory made known, and to see that land from that vantage point. And it tells us this, dear friends, as a lesson. If the Lord must deny us something, he can grant us something better in its place. He denied Moses Canaan, but afterwards Moses was in Canaan in Israel in a far better context to see the land, in a far better company. Jesus Christ transfigured, the Lord of glory, and he being there to see the land of Canaan. So if we don't have our heart's desire, he can fulfill it in another way. In fact, Psalm 145 verse 19 says, he will fulfill the desire of them that fear him. He might not give the exact thing we've asked for, but he'll fulfill the desire, and he'll gratify, give us something even better ultimately in its place. Don't ever feel hard done by. If you haven't had your prayer answered, if the Lord hasn't given you what you've asked for, it's not because he is not kind. It's because it wouldn't have been good for you, or there must be some reason why it was not right. But he can do better for you, and will do better for you, such that he'll fulfill the desire and you'll feel satisfied. The Lord has blessed me, even so, even more. Trust him for that. Let it suffice thee. Speak no more. This Jordan thou shalt not pass o'er, and yet upon the mount these 3, Moses, Elias, Christ, I see. 2 roads to Canaan thou hast given, one over Jordan, one from heaven. Joshua had the one over Jordan. Moses had the one from heaven. Well, the servant of the Lord. Let's seek to be in the same service, in the same quality and caliber by grace, and let us seek the same closing a life well lived, a service faithfully rendered. May Moses' God be our God forever and ever. Amen.